Hello, this is International Master and author John Watson. Welcome to Beyond the Opening. This is a show that explains positional ideas with a particular emphasis on pawn structures that recur throughout chess practice. The pawn structure is, as I have said, the biggest determinant of positional and tactical motifs in a position, as well as where your pieces are probably best placed for attack and defense. This will be my fourth lecture on doubled pawns. The subject of doubled pawns, as I've also mentioned, is a most complex one. It's one of the most complex in chess, actually, in terms of structural issues, and one of the most important topics of all of chess theory, because it determines so much else about the game. If you have doubled pawns. In the first lecture and most of the second, we looked at complexes of connected and mutually supported pawns, that is, pawns without directly weakened squares in the complex. Then we switched to doubled pawns in complexes which do contain a weakness, that is, a square or squares which can't be protected by adjacent pawns. There are at least 8 of these structures that occur repeatedly throughout different openings and middle games. That's not counting the fact, of course, that both sides can end up with the same structure, obviously. Most of these doubled pawn structures, many at least, are actually ignored in the literature for the most part, the literature on middle games, and even in the literature on pawn structures, partly because books usually simply copy what's in previous books and sort of what's traditionally shown as very simple examples, like the ones we've been looking at to start with. So which are very easy to talk about in general fashion. And ones that are a little more difficult we'll attack as we go along, but still very important ones. So I began with the most discussed of these structures, arising very famously and most often from the Nimzo-Indian defense, but also from quite a few other openings which I mentioned in the previous couple of lectures. So I'll finish with one more example of that well-known structure today, and then introduce a doubled pawn structure that we haven't seen before, and we'll just see how far we can get, because this first example is pretty long, but it is the last one, and it's important because it shows some new themes, quite a few new themes. It's also the modern way that you'll often see these positions develop. So let's just go right ahead. This game Dickinson Ems. This turns into a Samish variation by transposition. You may have noticed this. See, there are the doubled pawns, and the usual situation, black's a little ahead in development. He has the 2 knights, white has the 2 bishops, white has more central prospects, but that big weakness there. And black's position is very solid. So let's just continue here. The move c5, by the way, functions to block that pawn and stop c5. So by blockading that pawn, it sets it up as a target. And we're in a pretty basic kind of position. As I say, this one is going to probably come up from the Nimzo-Indian, but it has resemblances with other openings still. So now black's goal is very straightforward. He's trying to play this move and this move. And actually, if the pawn's defended, maybe play this move, so that after takes he can put yet another piece on that square. So he wants to just directly attack the weakness. White's plan is also pretty straightforward. He's going to expand in the center and use his big pawn structure. Actually try and exploit the fact that these doubled pawns are doing some good. That's attacking that square, and that's protecting his big center on d4. So the idea is simply to bowl over black's king. This particular move also opens up the idea of bishop g5 right away, and it's a little hard to get out of that pin. If you look at that for a second, you'll see what I mean. It's really hard to unpin the knight without weakening yourself, because black squared bishop is gone, so there's no bishop e7. And of course that's a major Nimzo-Indian defense theme. You might think, well, black's gotten these doubled pawns, why would white ever play this? But the major theme is trying to exploit the absence of the dark squared bishop. And another thing here, just to show you, is that something like this isn't really very good, even though it seems to open up things, because a move like this can come, and now there's more pressure here, and the bishop can't move, so you could even take that bishop at some point, and guess what square that weakens? C4 again. So that's highly undesirable. So getting back to what we have here, white starts advancing, and now this funny move. Now we haven't seen this yet in our example so far, and partly we haven't seen that because we're dealing now with the very modern idea of putting the pawn on c5. In the other examples we tended to put a pawn on e5, and maybe on c5 also, but at least we had one on e5. Here black is trying to prevent the advance of white's pawns, and it's strange, we've forgotten, it's so normal now, players who've seen a lot of Nimzo Indians, we forget how unusual this once seemed. Because black is intentionally, if you think about it, taking away his knight from the central squares, from control of these central squares, and he's doing it at the cost of a tempo, and he's leaving every piece but one on the back rank. So what is he doing? Well, he has several ideas behind this. On a specific scale, he's going to prevent bishop g5, and he can relocate to knight d6 to attack this pawn again. So now we're having all kinds of pieces that might attack that pawn. And once that pawn's gone, you not only win a pawn, but you reduce control over d5. What else is going on? In sort of a general sense, black wants to establish a blockade of white's pawns. Now he's already blockaded this pawn from moving ahead, and after white plays f4, he's going to blockade this way. So, and we'll see that. So we'll go back to that. We'll see that in a second. Instead of knight e8, just to show you what can happen in sort of a normal kind of sequence, black might play that move, and then there's this bishop g5 move we were worried about. So that would be a problem. Notice also that white could play just sort of straightforwardly with a move like maybe here, here, and maybe even here, trying to attack directly in the center. Optionally, there are other moves he can make. For example, this move, driving the bishop away, which is not always that good, but in this case it's looking more logical. Except that it's usually not good to bring your queen onto that side of the board if black can avoid bringing the bishop back to b7. So my mistake. In this case, actually, this is quite good for black because the rook is coming here and because the queen isn't going to participate in the attack over here on the king side. And we'll actually see examples like that. So let's just see how the game went, which is here, here, and we're coming right up. Okay, black starts the attack on that pawn. Now white wants to play f5 and extend his attack, maybe even f6, maybe e5, maybe bring the knight here, the queen over to the king side. All kinds of things going on there, and so black plays the move he's been intending to, f5. Now, this really addresses the problem of white's two bishops to some extent, because look at this bishop, it's blocked off, and look at this bishop, it's blocked off. So basically the c and the f pawns block off white's own bishops, and otherwise, here's what's going to happen. Let's see the bishops get a little more active. Say he doesn't play f5. Not that it's a doomed position, but let's just say he plays here and tries to attack this and even maybe win it immediately. Well, white just ignores that pawn because he's getting what he wants on the king side. And one example is here, and this very nice move, attacking the dark squares and breaking up the position over there. The problem is that if black takes this way, there's issues here. And it's very easy to get checkmated very quickly. And the most obvious move is to play here, keep the pawn structure intact, but now we have this move. And for example, well, if the queen moves, we're going to get something like this. And you can look at this in a second, but we're threatening knight g3s and e5s and all kinds of checkmates. Really, black isn't going to survive this. So he has to sort of remain in that pin unless he can get away with playing here. But that breaks up the king side too much. So you can see this is white's plan. Just sort of blast everything open, run to the king side, and be willing to sacrifice that pawn. That's just one pawn. And in return, he's actually getting kind of slaughtered. I mean, look at this position for a second. There are some doubled pawns for you. These weren't good, but these are really terrible, right? Because they cut off the defense completely. And not only are they weak, but there are two outpost squares now for white's knight. Look how that knight can just swing in there, or maybe in some cases swing over to f5. The queen is coming out. You can see this is really pretty doomed at this point. I don't know if it's worth giving some more moves. Let's just try here, here. Maybe the knight comes back. And here's a good move. Just threatening everything. Rook g4 check, rook h4, queen e3 times takes h6, rook af1, knight f5, h5. Anyway, this is all over, but good to look at. So let's just revert back to here. Now there's one other thing that white can do here. First of all, let's just see what goes on in the game. Black's going to blockade that pawn, so that kind of f4, f5 thing can't happen. So now white plays this move, attacking this pawn for the third time, you'll see. And he can do one other kind of idea that's worth maybe looking at. He can play, for example, here, and if that knight comes over to attack this, just ignore it again and play here. And then when probably the bishop takes because he doesn't want to be pinned, then he can run into something like this kind of position with a big cramp. Now black's a pawn up, and in fact this is a complicated position. It's not necessarily clear, but at least you can see how this could be very awkward for black, just because white has so much space and can basically try to attack on the queen side of all things, sort of kind of play like that, at least to begin with. And then there's eventually maybe the king side break. It's not that easy. Black's a pawn ahead and his pieces aren't that bad, but nevertheless it's at least, at the very least, quite dangerous. Okay, back to the game again. White plays this move knight g3, attacking this pawn 3 times. Black defends it, and white takes a pawn. So he's kind of giving up his idea of advancing those pawns. So it gives up some control of the center, but it does open the d file, for one thing, small point. And it avoids the possibility of c takes d, which might lead to that situation that we had where that rook is going to come down on an open file that way. What else does it do? Let me just real quick go back here. It opens up the bishop to some extent. It gives us something to do. It gives us something to attack. So we'll see how that goes in a second. Just to sort of see by practice how it goes. Black takes back. But let me just show you first what would happen if he didn't play d takes e5. I'm going to show you a very famous game, Yusupov-Karpov at this point, which demonstrates some characters of doubled pawns. Let me show you this pretty quickly. Black does a funny thing here that he hadn't done until this game. He straightens out the doubled pawns and then plays this remarkable move, which is here. Very odd move. And you might think, well, he's really straightening out all of white's pawns and making the two bishops more powerful by opening up the game. But here's what happens. Black takes, and now he manages to break up the pawn structure this way. So he's just changing the pawn structure around radically, and that changes the nature of the game. So now there's still pressure on here, and there's an open file against that pawn, so white closes that file. And if you look at this for a second, the smoke is sort of cleared here, and black has some advantages such as an outpost on e4. That's one advantage he has, and he's got white's very bad bishop, which is cut off by its own pawns. So the important point, though, is he still has this outpost here. He has this major square, and that square can be occupied by what, 3 different pieces. So it's easy to keep that outpost, and it's a powerful square. It has a lot of influence. So this has to do with it's an example of the saying that it's not always the weak pawns that count when you have doubled pawns. It's the square that the pawn stands on. So even though the c4 pawn's not there anymore, black he's liquidated that pawn, those pawns, but he has command of those squares. So in fact it's not that easy, because it was white's move and he managed to get some activity here in the game by playing this very good move, this excellent move. And still, after this happened and this happened, white took and black took. And I'm not going to go into much detail here, but these outposts, this is an issue too at some point if this knight moves. And the knight's very restricted. The white knight is very restricted, can't go forward. It just turned out that black very soon got this move knight e4 in and actually won this pawn and had 2 passed pawns. So, and white's bishop is still bad. It's not that easy. It's a complicated position, but this is enough. This is far enough to go. Okay, but we're going back to what happened in the real game, which was this. And opening up some lines. That's what I wanted to show you. Now he attacks this pawn with tempo. Black defends that. There's really only one other really logical way to defend that without walking onto the file, which is to play here. And that's a good picture to look at, actually, because look at White's bishops. They're both running, again, they're running into their own bishop pawns, but going the other way, they're also running into the enemy bishop pawns. So they're really stuck. The advantage, of course, is that he has open files, open and D files, and B files. So there's a lot of pressure. There's a weak pawn here, there's a weak square here, there's this outpost here. On the other hand, those bishops are just awful, and Black has a very nice outpost on E4, for example, for a bishop or a knight or a rook. And he also still has this weak pawn on C4, so there's knight A5 takes C4, that kind of stuff. So it's a very double-edged game. One way to activate here for White, because of these awful bishops, is to make a pseudo-sacrifice. This has been played a few times. Here, now White's a pawn ahead, but Black has this wonderful pressure coming down here. Really nice, much better than this bishop here. White might play here. And now an idea is, well, I think this move can be played, because if White takes that, there's queen h4, that kind of move is getting very strong, and rook h7 on the file. So Black's idea now is to play h4, maybe even h3 to really extend this bishop's influence, and of course rook g7 to attack down here. It's not easy. It's a fairly equal game. White does have an extra pawn. He's got some squares to work with, but you can see at least that Black, for example, has that beautiful outpost on e4 for his bishop, and White doesn't have anything similar for his bishop. So once again, let's sneak back here. So that's one way of trying to simplify, is with this bishop move here. But instead, Black plays queen a5, and White simply takes over the file. He's going to give these up and try and activate his bishops. Not sure if that rook b1 move was so good. Maybe a little better was to immediately put the bishop on a better square here, so that it has more options of going that way, but also attacking this. So if the knight comes back up to defend, then the queen can zoom in. It just gets complicated. He's using his active pieces a little bit better in a line like this. What happened was maybe a little more passive. This rook b1 move leaves more things hanging. Nevertheless, okay, White keeps attacking. Black makes a natural move. White makes a natural move, getting online. And Black starts to reorganize. The idea there is to cut off the attack to some extent and to cover this pawn. And maybe this kind of thing is going to follow. There's also the idea of bringing the queen up here, now that that c-pawn is protected, and taking this way. So that pawn is not going to last forever, so White needs to get something going. But you can see now Black really has exploited the weaknesses here. The doubled pawn also created that a-pawn weakness, and these all of a sudden are all able to be taken. They're all vulnerable. So Black's long-term plan has worked very well here, and it's just a question of whether White can fight back with his bishops and maybe fight back on the king side. So White actually played to protect the c-pawn. And Black made that move I was talking about, attacking that pawn there, because that's the key pawn. If you can get rid of that, he's in good shape. Okay, now there's a possibility of doubling here and winning one of these pieces, or at least creating huge problems. So Black moves that knight and is just in time, or tripling actually White could have done, just in time to block that file. So Black's pretty much shored up his position. He's ready to go after the c-pawns, and White needs to open more lines. So he tries to. Notice he's kind of in a hurry here. He can't let that side of the board fall apart. Okay, the rook's attacked. And it's funny because that looks like the only move, but it's also possible to take advantage of the relative lack of kingside defenders here and really go for broke with a move like this. And if you look at this here, you might think a move like rook f6 isn't so bad, but you see there's a big attack here. You might think that that's a reasonable move, but the fact is Black's pieces are completely cut off from the defense. So in a position like this, attacking the rook, maybe queen here, attacking the pawn on h7, you can see that things really aren't going very well. All of White's pieces are being activated here. For example, after this, you can just look at this yourself, but now there's bishop g5, there's knight e4. There's just too many pieces that are attacking here. Rook e1, of course, just take over the file. All kinds of good things happening here. You can check that out yourself, but that's completely winning. So Black would have to respond to that differently, probably by sacrificing back at this point, which is pretty perfectly reasonable, but not absolutely decisive. Something like this. White's still got some themes. Might even just be just about equal. He also has rook e1 and bishop d7. There are things going on here, but black has nice material. Okay, so white really should have tried something like that, because look what happens now. I just wanted to say that that was an example. That last position we were looking at was an example of these pieces being sort of cut off from the defense. And Kasparov used to call this cutting the board in two. Sometimes the doubled pawns do it themselves. So rook d5 ends up being just a little too slow, because black can go ahead and attack this pawn again. And really he's pretty safe in the middle of the board. Once again, he should probably play here, because these pieces have drifted away from the defense. So we ought to try that attack in any case, whether it works or not. Instead, he plays a very natural move, attacking on the king side, but it just turns out to be so slow that black gets in first. Goes attacking the rook already, and whereas now really white's position collapses because black's already broken through and won all of those light squares there. He tries to get some compensation in a sort of an endgame, but already resigns at this point. And it's not just that black's he'll be taking that and taking that. It's not just that black's a pawn ahead, but he has pressure just everywhere. There's rook b8, b2, all kinds of moves like that. I mean, just for example, let me see what might happen here. For one thing, black's threatening what? Knight here, and after takes, just king e6 winning the rook, or knight b6 maybe winning the rook. Let me see how that would go. Yeah, I guess king e6 winning the rook. So knight d4 is sort of a threat, so white might play here, and then black can do various things, but taking over the file can't be bad. Maybe coming here. There's other ways to win this, but this is a pretty basic way, because now everything's lost. I mean, you can always win that. And if he goes here, that's just turns out to be a blunder because of this sequence. So, just for fun. Anyway, the moral of the story there is white's attempt to use his two bishops and break through on the king side, because he has permanent disadvantages on the queen side, which were blocked by that move. The double pawns were blocked by that move c5, and so that was very instructive how black went after all those. So let's just move on to another game. Now, a couple of weeks ago I showed a skeleton diagram of 4 basic types of double pawn complexes, ones which include a weakness. Moving to the right in that diagram, we get this picture, also of doubled bishop pawns, but this time on the king side. This is a structure that comes up at least as often for black as it does for white, and it generally comes about because one side fianchettos, or tries to fianchetto, his king's bishop, and his piece is captured on f6 or f3. So, for example, white's pawn structure could come about when black plays something like here and here, or here and here, or sometimes here, 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 and here. Fantastic artwork there. And there are other ways that this can happen. Notice also that if a pawn advances to, say, f5 or f4, f4 or f5, that would be the other move, this is a structure that would come up, for example, when white captures a piece on f5. For example, in the Slav variation, we have a position where white plays knight here and takes a bishop on that square, and black retakes with the e-pawn. So if we followed that up with g6, we'd have this exact position. And obviously the opposite happens too. There's the variation in the Nimzo Indian we showed you, where the queen here captured a queen there. Black played queen takes and ran over to this square. And again, that structure developed. So what else is going on here? Really, in the past couple of decades, an amazing number of variations in all kinds of different openings have resulted in this basic pawn structure, mainly because black, or white in the reverse position, has begun to see that the doubled pawns have their advantages as well as their disadvantages. The weaknesses here are on f3 and f6, and it's not completely unimportant as a weakness, obviously. Any weakness is a weakness. but it's certainly not as important as the one on c4 in that Nimzo Indian defense structure. c4 was much more important, partly because the weaknesses on the third rank in principle are easier to defend than ones in the fourth rank, and also because there's little prospect of these ever being attacked, this pawn here, these pawns here, by a rook on an open file, as happened in the Nimzo Indian case, or by a queen for that matter, as happened in the Nimzo Indian case. So that's good so far, but there are problems with the doubled pawns. The first and most fundamental one is that the complex structure here can't easily lead to a passed pawn, can't create a passed pawn. Even though it's a 4-3 majority, I guess I should say that either this pawn wouldn't be here or this pawn wouldn't be here, because only one of them is doubled in our hypothetical case. So even though it would be a 4-3 majority, you can't create a passed pawn. Also, capturing by the e-pawn, this is a little abstract, but capturing by the e-pawn simply means you don't have an e-pawn to defend this or this square or this square at some point. So it sort of leaves it easier for black to attack those squares, and those are central squares, obviously. So before we get to the advantages of this kind of doubled pawn structure, which we haven't talked about, let's look at some of the problems associated with it. Here's a game between Karpov and Brown from 1972, symmetrical English. It looks pretty innocent so far. Black sets up with a common fianchetto, and white decides to make this move that is pretty natural once you look at it, but on the other hand, anytime you give up the two bishops, it's a little funny, especially since that bishop took really two extra moves to get out before it was exchanged. So let's just see how this works. This is a drawback to black's doubled pawns, of course. The e-pawn has disappeared, and so it can't cover this square, or even this square, whereas white still can cover those squares, his equivalent squares, with his central pawns, his 2-to-1 majority in the center. Now this is a pretty extreme example because white has this outpost here on d5. So that's obviously giving you compensation for two bishops. But it's worth mentioning that even if this pawn was back here somewhere, and for example later if black played c6 and d5 just to get some space in the center and challenge the center and not have a disadvantage there, white could take. By that point he'd have a knight here probably, and that would become an isolated pawn at that point. Now that kind of isolated pawn clearly isn't as bad as having this outpost there, but it would show some disadvantage to having these because it couldn't be protected by the e-pawn again. So that move inherently has some problems. So let's just continue here. Just pretty normal looking moves. White's trying to cover this even more. And black plays a natural move which opens up his bishop, and that's certainly a strong piece. It does, if you'll notice, block this piece on the c8 h3 diagonal, because even if d6 is played, the bishop doesn't have as much scope. However, this can be solved to some extent by putting the bishop on this diagonal, and we'll see that. So white keeps developing, both sides develop, and black starts attacking a little bit on the queen side, which is a smart idea. Okay, white decides he has a permanent advantage, which is these doubled pawns and the fact that white has an extra central pawn. So he, for the moment, just plays very solidly. Let's keep going here. At least black's getting all the pieces out. I should say that because this knight can go here, there's really just no way that black can challenge that square enough times to exchange all the pieces off there without making some other huge concession. So white really has that outpost. A lot of times you get an outpost on d5 and black just manages to kind of exchange it off a few times until you either have a pawn there or at least you don't have a piece there. So that can't really happen here if you look at it. Okay, a little bit of pressure there. And white plays in very Karpovian style this simple move, attacking the queen, by the way. And black isn't too unhappy to get this off. After all, there's no open file against this weak pawn here, and he's got two bishops. Huge outpost, of course, but can you really win with just one good feature in the position like that? So let's see. I don't know if all these moves are exactly the best. Just for example here, I think it would be nice to make that a static weakness, because those knights are going to be very good at attacking a static weakness. maybe a knight here, for example. That's not going to be easy to defend, and I think that might be a slightly better way to play it. As it happens, he plays this first, and then it's not quite as easy. In some senses, well, it just depends which advantage you want, but this one seems a little more abstract at first, because you don't have that open file, for one thing. So here's where it gets sort of interesting. Black makes a natural move to cover this, and there's no little tactics down there, for one thing. And White starts converting his advantage. He switches from emphasis on the outpost on d5 to creating a passed pawn. And what really does it, what does that say about this? Well, it says that, okay, Black couldn't create a passed pawn on that side of the board, and really White's basic advantage in this position is his queenside majority, trying to create a passed pawn. He did have to look at the next few moves, though, to figure out whether this was really going to work. Okay, still has the passed pawn, but Black plays very logically and attacks the pawn, at which point you might think this is going pretty decently. White plays this move. Of course, he had calculated all this. You'll see the point of that. Well, the first point of that is just that it's attacking this. We'll see that. He also might have tried this first, and then this kind of move. It turns out that's maybe has a little more point in some ways. It's a little more. Well, for one thing, he can't take that because of this, obviously. At any rate, that's worth thinking about if you're going to go over this game afterwards. But he plays here first, and really he better take that, because otherwise there's moves like knight b6, all kinds of it, and then knight d7, all kinds of issues. So they simply exchange pawns, but look, White still got his majority, doesn't he? And even when you protect that a6 pawn, it's still vulnerable as an isolated pawn. So now White has a queenside majority, and Black has a target over there, which is going to tie him down. Okay, now there's this problem, this knight coming here. So, and now White's bringing his pieces up aggressively, and Black plays a logical move, because these knights are awfully strong on these squares. If you get a knight on d5 and c4, that's pretty bad. So White takes one of the ways of simplifying here. And Black says, okay, I'm going to make use of that bishop before you go knight c4, and figures he can probably hold this endgame. But the interesting thing is that the problem with these passed pawns, these doubled pawns, has suddenly made it all the way to the endgame, and created really a problem that can't be solved anymore, because the outside passed pawn created by this queenside majority is going to win the game now. Well, getting this far, of course, is the mark of a real master for White. Nevertheless, it's a fundamental disadvantage that persisted all the way to the endgame, which makes it pretty relevant for the kind of things that we're looking at, because we're trying to look at things that structural issues that do persist, or at least get transformed in another structural issue. Okay. What White does here is he just sort of, now Black's tied to the A pawn, so what we're getting effectively here is a sort of a Zugzwang. It's hard for Black to make any moves besides just sort of wasting time. And let's just see what happens here for a second. Okay. Okay, so everything looks the same, but White just makes a slow move, and now Black has to start wasting time with his kingside pawns, or else give way, for example, by going here. And the problem with trying to go the other way, which looks very natural with this move, is that White has this little trick. And this is, of course, very easily winning for White, because he just comes in and vacuums up all these pawns. So he's not able to do that, and since he's not able to do that, he's going to have to, and he can't move the knight. It's a kind of Zugzwang, so he has to just kind of make some moves. White still is thinking, by the way, about this move b4 at some point, but he doesn't really need it because Black's going to run out of moves. Okay, that's a good move because it really stops the pawns from even sacrificing themselves. And after Black plays there, White now has pressure on that square too, and that means that his king can walk up because Black has to defend that side of the board. And this becomes kind of routine. Okay, he could probably move the king up, but that's even kind of prettier, because it absolutely blocks these pawns from creating any sort of chances, trading themselves off, and maybe being able to trade into a get rid of the last pawn on the board. So let's just finish this up here. King comes up, and White's all ready to defend those two pawns. So Black does finally get in, but you can imagine White's just winning the race here by sort of a landslide. He just brings the other pawn up. and gets there before black does. So I think he resigns at this point. Without the pawn even being here, it's very, very easy. In any case, we're not going to analyze this, but this is a win. You can look at this yourself. This is a pretty easy win, and so Brown resigned. So that finishes up this lecture. It went on just a bit too long, but I wanted to make sure that I got all the last themes in on that famous Nimzo-Indian doubled pawn structure over here. And because that's important to see what different ways, how these, for one thing, how these squares can be weak even if the pawns don't exist anymore. If they get exchanged off, the square is still weak and can be attacked. Then we switch to this doubled F pawn structure here, and hopefully learned a little bit about how those pawns are, at least why they can be bad, and then next we'll look at why they can be good. So thank you very much. This has been Beyond the Opening with John Watson.